Hello and welcome to Mobility Now, a television show of the Houston-Galveston Area Council. I'm your host, Alan Clark, HGAC's Director of Transportation. Today we'll discuss the transportation of commercial goods, also called freight. Let's take a look at this video on how we get the goods we use every day.
Many people start each morning with a cup of coffee. But as you sip, do you ever think about how your coffee got to the cafe? That coffee and millions of other items are transported through a multi-step process our economy depends on. First, the coffee beans, called cargo or freight, are brought on a ship to a U.S. port facility.
About 8,500 ships call on the Port of Houston each year and over 200,000 barge transits each year. The port's future is very rosy. The population of Texas is going to double in size. That's a huge growth in our marketplace. The Panama Canal, people tell you that Houston is one of the premier ports that will benefit from the widening and deepening of the canal. So you look at the middle part of the United States, there's 100 million people and this port serves because of its strategic location, most of that part of the United States. And now we've become the largest, fastest growing coffee exchange port in the United States. Coffee comes in bags, is stored in a warehouse, maybe 1, 2, 3 years, and then a broker buys it.
Next, the coffee could travel by truck or rail, depending on its destination. More than 2,000 trains travel through the region each week.
We have over 800 miles of freight rail track within our region, and there's some 1,200 at-grade crossings, 700 of which are in the city. We have 2,200 trains that operate on a weekly basis. Each of those trains takes about 280 18-wheelers off of our highways and bridges. If you do the math on that, that's over 600,000 18-wheelers removed from our highway system on a weekly basis. And so products are shipped in through the port and they go to the distribution center, and from there they're moved by freight or trucks throughout our country.
A truck transports the coffee to a roasting plant where employees prepare it to be sold. Almost 1 million jobs in the region rely on cargo, from truck drivers to business owners and their employees. Next, a truck transports the coffee beans. Nowadays, trucks are the most common vehicles for transporting freight. As consumer demand for goods increases, so does the number of trucks on the roads. More trucks mean increased roadway and environmental impacts, noise, and congestion. Finally, the coffee beans arrive at your local cafe. Many other goods are transported the same way, but sometimes the process is different. Millions of pounds of cargo are also transported by air. Oil, the backbone of the region's economy, relies on pipelines, another critical part of the freight transportation network. All modes of transportation must work together to move freight. The Houston-Galveston region is growing, but with globalization, the world only seems to be smaller. The Panama Canal will be expanded to keep up with increased international freight travel. We must take care of this transportation system and make sure all the branches continue to work together. Our economy depends on it. Besides, how else would you get your morning coffee?
My guest today is Harris County Judge Ed Emmett. Judge Emmett is chairman of the Transportation Policy Council and a member of a steering committee for an HGAC freight study. Welcome, Ed. How are you today?
It's good to be here, Alan.
Judge, you not only are the judge of Harris County, but you served almost 10 years in the state legislature where you were on the House Transportation Committee. You also have served in Washington on the Interstate Commerce Committee, one of the premier freight regulatory organizations in the United States, and you've consulted with the freight industry. How would you describe the impact of freight to the Houston-Galveston region?
Well, quite simply, Alan, without freight, we don't have an economy. And so if you look at where the great cities of the world are, they all have some tie to freight. In the old days, of course, they were all built around ports. And Houston, our city fathers, way back when, 100 years ago, decided to dig the ship channel, a ditch 50 miles inland to make us a port. And the economy here has never been the same, fortunately. The question now is, how do we handle it going forward?
And of course, our region has 3 other major ports serving the area as well. And once freight gets here on a ship, it still has to get to its destination.
Right. In the old days, freight tended to stay close to a port. But now the freight that comes in, particularly that's containerized, could end up anywhere in North America. A lot of the freight, in fact, that comes to our area gets off the ship in Los Angeles, Long Beach, and comes by train here. A lot of the containers that will be unloaded in Houston or Freeport in our area may end up in Chicago. So it's all different. But every freight move ends with a move by truck. And that's something people need to understand, because that's what adds to the congestion of the roads.
Now, I've heard that almost 1 million jobs in our region are directly dependent on freight activity because they're either involved in transportation or maybe they're a manufacturer which needs to have freight to be able to get its raw materials or its goods back out of our region.
Well, if you look, you know, I'm one of those people that freight transportation's kind of been my adult life profession. And as you drive through the city, you'll see where railroad tracks used to go to warehouses. Groceries used to be delivered by railroad. The truck replaced a lot of that. Then the containers came along, and a lot of international freight started coming in. Freight's a constantly changing dynamic, and what everybody has to understand, no matter what business you're in, the cost of moving that freight frequently is the difference between a profit and not making a profit.
And the cost of moving that freight is something that we see every day, I guess, as you said, when we go to the grocery store.
Sure, it's a logistics industry. You know, just this morning, had fruit on my cereal. And I don't know if you've looked at where the fruit comes from, but I think I had raspberries from Chile and the blueberries were from Mexico, and all that had to get here somehow.
And when we come back, how freight impacts our region. Welcome back to Mobility Now. My guest, Harris County Judge Ed Emmett, and I are discussing freight travel in the Houston-Galveston region. Judge, as we were talking about the need for freight, how it supports our region's economy is growing, and I assume that the freight activity is going to have to grow as well.
Oh, absolutely. You look what's going on in terms of the oil industry right now with all the drilling in the Eagle Ford Shale. A lot of that pipe is coming in through our ports or by rail from other parts of the country or by truck. There are all kinds of other things. Container traffic is increasing all the time as we have more and more global trade. Everything like tennis shoes or the new Walmart distribution center over in Chambers County. All those are adding to the freight traffic that's coming into our community. But when you realize that Harris County alone is larger than 24 states, of course we're going to have a lot of freight.
And our region is growing as a region in terms of population as well. I mean, we're, what, over 6 million people in our 8-county area?
Probably.
And probably going to add something between 3 to 3.5 million people just in the next 30 years. And
that builds in a conflict. You have freight traffic, you have to have it for the economy to work. But at the same time, you've got all those people who are trying to move about, get to their jobs, to their schools, run their errands on a daily basis. So it builds in a conflict between freight and commuters. And the h-gac freight study looked at those issues, the opportunity that comes along with having a robust industry like our freight and our ports, our manufacturers, and then the conflict that can sometimes come up when people live near those activities. What do you hear from as complaints as the judge of Harris County? Well, the complaints are all across the board, but most people understand that it's good for the economy to have the freight. One of the problems, though, let's take the railroad industry. The railroad tracks are where they are based on historical decisions made 100, 120 years ago. My favorite is that the line that goes between Bel Air and West University, known as the terminal sub for those in the business, goes right by Memorial Park. It was put there back in the early 30s, I believe, to get it completely outside the city of Houston. Well, of course, now it's inside Loop 610. If you look on the east end of Houston and Harris County, you have all these freight railroads where you have children trying to go to school, And you know, we've got to do something to move that freight out of the congested areas, and that's going to take a lot of money.
And of course, the concerns about freight aren't limited to the railroads either. There's a lot of trucking on our major highways and even on some of our major thoroughfares.
Well, and most people, unfairly, I might add, the only time they think about a truck is when they look in their rearview mirror and they see nothing but a grill. And so they get mad at the truckers, but the truckers don't want to be in the traffic any more than the traffic wants them there. So we have to find ways to reroute a lot of that freight traffic and make it more efficient. But as I said earlier, almost every piece of freight, its final move is going to be by truck. And that's just something we have to live with.
Well, in the h-gac study, you looked at some of those issues. What were some of the recommendations coming out of that study about how we could make this freight activity a better neighbor?
Well, of course, one of the main reasons for the freight study was to identify where are the likely freight corridors and make improvements to those specific corridors. Of course, one of the best things we could do is make sure that more of the traffic coming out of the port goes by rail and is taken out of the congestion before it's ever put on a truck. And maybe that would help alleviate a lot of the congestion that we have.
And I recall the freight study did make several recommendations about improving, working with the railroads to get improvements in sections of track that today are a bottleneck for cross-street traffic.
Yeah, we have at-grade crossings, particularly on the east end, where when a train's going by, traffic can't move. And trains now have gotten a lot longer. I drive out the Hardy Toll Road fairly regularly, and I get to look at those trains. And I remember when I was a kid, if you saw a 30 or 40 car train, that was a big deal. Today, you see them, they're 100, 120 car unit trains coming down from Montana and places like that.
And some of the major highway recommendations in the regional transportation plan were talked about as well that could be important to freight. What about State Highway 99? I know that's a project you have worked on.
The Grand Parkway, it's been around since the mid-'80s, and it's changed form several times. It originally was going to be a parkway, a scenic route. But now, because of the growth in our region, the people, the number of people, the number of businesses that have located, it will become a major highway just like Beltway 8. The state of Texas is now responsible for building the Grand Parkway throughout the northwest part of Harris County and across Montgomery County.
I know in the freight study there are other highways that are important to the region that are also important for freight. Some of them were like State Highway 36 coming up out of Freeport in Missouri County. Even US 290 carries a substantial amount of freight, as does Interstate 10 and 45.
But the one that we have got to get an answer to sooner or later is Highway 146. It's the one that runs next to both of the container terminals in the Port of Houston, and it's absolutely critical that we do something for 146.
And if there's any continued growth in freight from the Port of Galveston, from the Port of Texas City, very likely a lot of that freight would like to travel up Interstate 45 or State Highway 146 before it even gets to the Port of Houston. Right.
I mean, coming out of Galveston, there's only a couple of ways you can get out. So that will be the case. And you mentioned Freeport earlier. You know, Freeport's going to continue to grow as a port, and more of that traffic will be coming our way.
Not only does that freight travel over the major state highways, but you mentioned earlier on major thoroughfares as well. And part of this study looked at some of those issues. Some of those recommendations, if I remember, were trying to improve the truck lanes so that the trucks could make safer turns along that route, trying to maybe even encourage trucks to stay where there's less conflict with residential activity.
But that's such a difficult thing because trucks need to go where they need to go. I know that sounds repetitive, but they have a destination that they need to get to, and some of those destinations, there's only one route you can take and get there in a logical way. We need to be aware of that. So frequently I get asked all the time, why don't we have truck-only lanes? And of course, the answer to that is the highways weren't designed for that.
Right.
And if you put all the trucks in one lane, you'll destroy that lane very, very rapidly.
But we are going to look for some innovative ways. Maybe we can provide better information to the truckers themselves so that they don't get lost on the way to the port. I hear that sometimes happens.
I'm sure that that happens, and when you realize that most truckers are paid by the mile, they're going to take, the route that's dictated by.
They sure don't want to get lost, do they?
Well, they don't want to get lost, and they certainly don't want to get stuck in traffic, because if they're sitting in traffic, they're not making any money.
Stand by after this break. We'll discuss the anticipated growth of our freight system. Welcome back to Mobility Now. My guest, Judge Ed Emmett, and I are discussing freight travel in the Houston-Galveston region. Judge, I have to ask you about something that many people have heard about. It's the widening and deepening of the Panama Canal.
Right.
And I've heard some expressions of concern, quite frankly, that this is going to rapidly mean a huge growth in freight to our part of the world.
Well, Alan, with or without the widening, deepening of the Panama Canal, I hope our area does continue to grow relative to the freight, and I think it will. You're going to have trade coming from places like Brazil and India and even Africa. And if you just look at a map or a globe, the bigger ships are going to come to North America, make one stop, unload, reload, and go back. And as you look at that map, we are perfectly positioned to be the gateway of North America, which is good for our region. It will make our economy boom even more than it is today. So that's a good thing. The Panama Canal, I'm a little bit contra compared to some. It will add some traffic to our region, but traffic coming out of Asia, if it stops on the west coast of the United States or even the west coast of Mexico, they save 15 to 20 days transit time versus going through the Panama Canal. We'll have some traffic through the Panama Canal, and that will be good for us, but it's nothing compared to what we're going to get across the Atlantic, which will be an absolute boon for us.
It does take a lot of different pieces in place for freight to work. I know we've talked at the Transportation Policy Council about a major trade corridor, which is referred to as Interstate 69. We know it as US 59 in our part of the region. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the kinds of major pieces that are going to be keys to having a successful market for this freight growth in our area.
Well, freight has to be able to move. Otherwise, it'll go somewhere else. If you look at the United Kingdom, for example, the ports of London, Liverpool were bypassed by a brand new port that nobody had ever heard of before, because that's where the freight could come into and move easily. We need to have that same circumstance here. We need the freight to be able to come here, but it doesn't do any good for it to just be unloaded off the ship. It needs to get to its final destination. That's why all these improvements, such as changing US 59 to Interstate 69, are so important. And one of the big changes there is the bypass had always been conceived as going west of the city of Houston. Well, now people have figured out it's better to go south and east so that it could pick up that traffic from Freeport, Galveston, Texas City, and the Port of Houston before going up into the Midwest.
So you're talking about a major route for particularly trucks coming to and going from our region that would take them near the port areas, but then they're headed, say, to the north or go on the east side.
Chicago to the north, Mexico to the south. And we always have to remember that, Mexico is going to be a huge trading partner, not only with the United States, but with the whole world sooner or later. And we have to factor that in.
And if we can avoid some of that freight having to go through the core part of our region,
absolutely,
where it would encounter the normal congestion that we experience every day, that could be a big help to our area.
We have to make decisions now that are going to look good 25 and 30 years from now, because just look how much growth we've had in the last 25 or 30 years. Well, the same's going to occur in the future. So the decisions we make now are every bit as important as that original decision made by the folks back in the early 1900s to build the Houston Ship Channel.
And I know in our study, we saw that these costs could be pretty significant, but we also saw they had a lot of benefit for people who live here, not just companies that happen to be here as well. But how do you think we can pay for such a large system? We've done a lot of this locally through local governments.
We have, and here in Harris County, nobody likes paying tolls, but having the Harris County Toll Road Authority gave us a system. Where would we be without Beltway 8? Where would we be without West Park or Hardy? So we've had that good fortune. Those were decisions made long ago. We need to make similar decisions now, and when it comes to how do you pay for it, the Texas legislature is going to have to come up with a new means of paying for highway improvements. There's no ferry on high that's going to come down and say, here's a highway for you. It's got to be paid for with something.
Well, in the past, we were able to pay for most of our highway improvements either from local property taxes or revenues or from vehicle registration fees or the old gas tax. But we've talked about this on our show before. Those sources just aren't as productive as they used to be.
Now, the gasoline tax particularly, that was the big one. And a lot of it has been diverted to other purposes. But even if you change the diversions and put it all into highways, the gasoline tax was a flat 20 cents. It was never a percentage. So as a result, it has not kept pace with inflation over the years. And cars have become more fuel efficient.
Even trucks.
Even trucks. So, and if you take electric vehicles, they don't pay any gas tax at all.
Do you think that the federal government will play a major role in freight in the future?
Well, the federal government will always, they always have and they always will. I mean, they were instrumental in the development of ports in our history. They were instrumental in the development of the intercontinental railroads. They were instrumental in developing the interstate highway system, which allows our logistics to flow. So, of course, they'll play a big role. The problem is the federal government doesn't have any money either. And while they have the ability to print money, that's not the best thing in the world to do. So we are going to have to, I think, invest in the infrastructure that will allow our economy to continue to grow. If we don't invest in that infrastructure, the economy will stagnate and we'll all pay a much heavier price.
Well, and there's been a long tradition of public and private partnership in the transportation area as well.
Well, and now we have new ones. The railroads have been reluctant in years past to get involved with a public-private partnership. But now they realize they need the help also. So if you eliminate a grade crossing, for example, the railroad benefits by having better flow on its track. At the same time, the public benefits by not having all those cars and trucks wait on that train to go by.
And I know we're working on some projects now with the Gulf Coast Rail District where half the money, if these projects go forward, will probably come from the railroads. Half of it might be coming from some public sources.
Right. We have to improve the rail system. I mentioned earlier, the rail system in the Houston area was designed well over a century ago, and it doesn't make sense. And it was designed at a time when railroads carried passengers. So a lot of those rail lines go to downtown. Well, we don't really need freight railroads going downtown.
Well, Judge, I'm sorry that we've covered so little of this topic, but that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank you for being my guest today, Harris County Judge Ed Emmett, and thank you for watching Mobility Now. Let's get moving.